Good?
Go for it.
Son, have you seen the world? What would you say if I told you I could hand you this gun, and you'd even get paid?
That sounds pretty good. A hero of war? Yeah, that's what I'll be.
A hero of war? Yeah, that's what I'll be.
And when I come home, they'll be damn proud of me.
Black leather boots that shine so bright.
They cut off all my hair, but it looked alright. As we learned how to fight, we all became friends.
We marched and we sang. We all became friends.
I'll carry this flag because it's a flag that I love.
I'll carry this flag into a grave if I must, because it's a flag that I love. When I come home,
They'll be damn proud.
And when I come home,
They'll be damn proud. For almost a year, the soldiers of the 1451st Transportation Company had been escorting trucks full of gasoline, building materials, and other supplies along Iraq's dark, dangerous highways.
There had been injuries, but no one had died.
every day felt surreal.
Their luck evaporated less than 2 weeks before they were to return home.
I kicked in the door.
I yelled my commands.
I got my man back over his face.
We took him away from his family and his friends.
They took off his clothes. They pissed in his hands.
I told him to stop.
My mind seemed to switch off when I needed it the most. I joined in. We beat him with guns and batons.
Not just once.
But again and again.
I felt like I was watching from the sidelines. I lost 2 good friends. I'm having a hard time dealing with it. I've let those around me down.
The 2 men were popular and respected.
By the time I got up there, the gun truck was just in flames. It was as though I wasn't there.
The fire was so intense they had to wait for it to burn down to retrieving the bodies.
He was freaking out.
I've never been through anything like this before.
I've been through some IEDs, some explosions, some being shot at. A couple of buddies of mine got hurt, but I've never been through anything similar to this in my life. And when I come home,
They'll be damn proud.
She walked through bullets and haze,
I asked her to stop.
I begged her to stay.
but she pressed on.
He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, blew the smoke upward.
I lifted my gun and I fired.
The shells jumped through the smoke and into the sand. The blood now had soaked.
She collapsed with a flag in her hands, a flag white as snow.
And when I come home,
They'll be damn proud.
A hero of war? Is that what they see?
medals and scars, and I brought home that flag.
So damn proud.
Talked a lot about the flashbacks I was having that made me feel angry. How could this have happened to me?
Why couldn't I sleep? Why couldn't I stop the nightmares and thinking? The burning buildings and the mayhem of those couple of nights.
I couldn't work or concentrate, withdrawing further emotionally from my family.
These were not the kinds of things that,
in depression or anger, painful reactions to noise.
These were not the kinds of things I could talk to my wife about.
I have failed myself and having a hard time dealing with it. I brought home that flag, but now it gathers dust. It's a flag that I love, and it's the only flag I trust.
On December 9, 2007, heavily intoxicated, he lifted a 9mm handgun to his head during an argument with his girlfriend and pulled the trigger. He was 26.
Over the next year, 3 more soldiers from 1451st would take their own lives.
The number of suicides reported by the Army has risen to the highest level since record-keeping began 3 decades ago.
These statistics, of course, do not offer a full picture. Suicide counts tend to be undercounts, and the trend is less marked in other branches of the military.
The business-as-usual attitudes of the past are no longer appropriate.
Suicide is a complex act, a convergence of troubled strands.
Multiple deployments, relationship problems, financial pressures, drug or alcohol abuse.
If decades of studies on civilian suicides are any indication, soldiers who kill themselves are also likely to have emotional troubles like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or another illness.
His tendencies towards depression and self-destructive behavior were long-standing and clear.
While friends and those that cared about him tried to help, his vulnerabilities were missed or minimized by those whose job it was to intervene.
Discharged several years earlier for mental health problems.
He was called back again when the Army was desperate for troops to combat rising violence in Iraq.
He was not eager to go.
He was deployed even though at least 3 other soldiers had warned mental health screeners about his instability.
There was no reason for him to be in the war at all.
There was something fragile about him.
He really did care too much. He really did care a lot, I think too much, about what people thought.
His record of emotional problems extended back to his first years in the military.
He received an honorable discharge for his personality disorder and was placed in the inactive reserves.
Meaning that he can be called up again for active duty until his 8-year military obligation ended.
This kid did not need to be going to Iraq.
But an Army evaluation found him fit.
Guilt is a common theme in the narratives of soldiers haunted by war.
The bonds of loyalty and shared obligation the military instills to forge an effective fighting force can, in the aftermath of battle, curdle into obsession with failures, real or imagined.
The bomb that killed Sergeant Wallace and Schmidt left many in the 1451st feeling that the deaths were in some way their fault.
We all felt responsible.
In fact, 3 of the 4 soldiers who would later commit suicide had a direct connection with the events of that night.
He did not seem like the same person who had come home on leave.
He slept restlessly, sometimes grabbing or punching her in her sleep, and had nightmares about his 2 friends that had died.
He dreamt that they were still alive.
That they had come over and hung out, and he was trying to tell them that they were dead, but they didn't know what he was talking about.
He drank heavily.
When he was drunk, he could turn mean.
And the next morning, he wouldn't remember.
He continued to struggle with his wife.
She was a giant stress in his life.
Friends worried about him and called when they could.
In July 2007,
Sought help
sought help at a Veterans Affairs Medical Center, telling an intake counselor that he was experiencing sleeping problems.
Excessive worry and anxiety.
recurrent thoughts of death.
And other symptoms.
He answered yes to all 4 screening questions for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Traumatic experiences can create a prison of isolation.
A sense that only someone who has been through the same events can comprehend the intensity of feelings they arouse.
Researchers who study traumatic stress reactions have found that the way out is to talk about the trauma or exposure to it in a controlled fashion, gradually diffusing its emotional power.
But returning soldiers, especially men, seem strikingly unequipped to follow this path.
They tend to see weakness in sharing their emotional distress.
Many soldiers are convinced that veterans of earlier wars, Vietnam for example, or World War II, had it much worse, so they should not complain.
Veterans who seek formal counseling from a VA often hide or play down their suffering.
Sergeant Wilson, for example, whose suicide would come soon after, was used to protecting his family from parts of the military service that bothered him most.
But the evidence of his internal turmoil began to leak out when he returned to North Carolina from his 3rd deployment with the 1451st.
You could almost feel that something bad was going to happen.
Sergeant Parker would be the 3rd to take his life.
A thinker, not a talker, seemed determined to keep silence about his personal problems.
His deteriorating marriage, his insomnia, his feelings of guilt over the deaths of Sergeant Wallace and Schmidt.
He was introduced to another veteran.
He urged Sergeant Parker to attend support groups at a veteran center nearby.
You've got to get these things out and these feelings out.
I'm fine, Sergeant Parker replied.
I tried to understand.
But he would get mad at me and tell me that I don't understand, that I would never understand.
You don't know. You don't know anything. You weren't there.
Sound of a single gunshot. Standing in the apartment doorway.
Looking only to see his blood everywhere.
A hero of war? Yeah, that's what I'll be.
That was much better.
Okay.
Wow.